I've had a few crazy people tell me that they would happily watch extremely long form content of me talking about mostly anything programming was. So, well, be careful what you wish for. What I'm going to do is I've decided I will talk about a few topics that bother me in excruciating detail. And then those of you mad enough to watch it can tell me which parts resonated with you and what you learned. And I will mine that for content for the main channel. So, our first topic is why most people use the repository pattern incorrectly. And I mean most on the internet, not most in Unity or most in C#. Most people fundamentally do not understand the repository pattern. Let's have a look at what it is and go through the reasoning and explanation why. So, to start, let's make a new thing and we'll call it my application stuff. Now, I did some tests earlier, so there's going to be some related scripts nearby. We'll get into that in a second. So, we'll delete all of this to start. And the very first thing I want to draw our attention to is the idea of a good old-fashioned array. Arrays are great. Don't go away, not yet. Arrays are great. Why are arrays great? Well, because they represent something called an in-memory collection. In other words, there is stuff, it is somewhere, you want your stuff, you ask for your stuff, you get your stuff. All of the complexities about marshalling that information, loading it into memory, ensuring the registers in the right location is none of your business, because what you really care about is asking the questions. How many people do you have? What is the fifth person? Can I have the fifth person? Can you change the third person? So, with that in mind, let's take a much more realistic example, list of person. And that's most likely what we're going to have. List of people, serialized field, and ta-da, right? Now, here's where we get into some of the general concerns about a system like this. It's perfectly fine, but if we have functions later on to do stuff like add people, and we do our nice good old-fashioned people.add. Seems redundant, but the problem is, if we later on realize that we're doing a lot of work with people and we're doing various different things, we might want to actually put in various layers here. We might want to cache people, or maybe there's actually a queue of people that get pulled in at different orders or different things. In short, you don't really want to be dealing with this collection directly, because you don't really care about this collection. What you care about is the questions this collection lets you ask. So if this was a jobs-based thing, you might have a question like, the question you really want to ask is get people without jobs. And then that'll be your people find all where job is null. That's what you really want to ask. You don't actually care where that happens to be stored. Now, if this was a collection, maybe that's such a common query, you want to pre-calculate or to pre-cache it or something. At the moment, because you're accessing the list directly, you can't really do anything like that. You'd have to rewrite your code to have multiple lists and collections and things, when realistically that's not your concern. So that's one, is you don't want direct access to your data. Two, this thing here, this question, is actually really closely coupled to the list. This get people without jobs doesn't really exist in a vacuum. You can't get people without jobs without the people with which to ask the question about jobs. So this free-floating code, where does it really belong? And I'd argue it pretty much belongs like right there with the people. So traditionally you do something what's called a first-class collection. And first-class collection will basically say, you don't really care about list. What you actually care about is a thing that has people and can have questions asked about it, about people. And that would be nice. We'd have to have this kind of here. So a version of that is the repository pattern. And we'll start with a simple repository and we'll work our way up. So we'll actually take this, we'll cut this function, and we will change this from list of person. Now, Unity downside, this won't natively show up. A repository of a person. Now, there are ways around that. We can make this show up through a variety of interesting hacks, but that's out of the scope for what I want to know. Don't personal repository. Yeah, don't give it away just yet. Right. Personal repository, and to have our example of a query, we're going to add. So we can still, you'll notice add still functions because that's an expected behavior. But that previous question, which is display jobless people. Now that's what you'd have to do. No, you're just doing all the nonsense here. Print, and we'll do it for each. Why not? For each in jobless person, and we will say print person. So that's kind of what we have to say. But this query here is a mess. We shouldn't be needing to say, get me all the people where da-da-da-da-da. That's a very baked in question. Like I said, we know that's a question that comes with intrinsically the concept of people who happen to have jobs. And so that should really exist on a person. Now, just ignore all the magic here. We're not really going to cover that right now. So we'll say get people without jobs, and we'll just leave that there for now. And for various reasons, I'm just going to... no, I won't complicate things right now. Keep it simple. Keep it simple. So... yeah, so now, conceptually, you can say people dot, and I'll come back to that in a second. Get people without jobs. So, this is kind of what we want to say, right? People that get people without jobs. This is really handy, because now we can pass this person repository around, and any additional queries we have, if we happen to be doing a lot of sorting alphabetically, or we have to be sorting by job title or surname in reverse, we can add all of those directly to the people collection. I'm not going to do all of them now, but you kind of get the idea, right? If there's a bunch of queries that are directly related to person, we can add them to a person. So, with all of that said, that's the base level behavior of a repository. It is effectively a way to take a bunch of questions or things you might want to do with a collection, wrap them up together, and then give you a nice handy bucket. But that's not really a repository. That's, like I said, what's called a first-class collection. What's the difference between a first-class collection and repository? Well, a repository has an additional goal, which is, we talked before about this, our good old-fashioned people array, and the really handy benefit that it looks like it's in memory. You don't have to think about the memory marshalling stuff. The problem is, what a lot of people do is they will create a variation of this, which is for saving to file. Because obviously, if you're just going to store it in a list, then maybe this is too much work for you, or it's not really worth all the effort. So what I'll demonstrate here is if we have a contract for a person repository, and it will be a repository of person, and it will we'll take our function here, don't worry, don't focus too much on the code. None of this is particularly important right now. I'll come back to the hyper-specific details of how this works afterwards. And I'll do the same thing here just for parity reasons. And we will need that. Again, we'll go over all the magic that just happened in a second. It doesn't really matter. But what matters is this. Personal repository is an iPerson repository. Everything else is the same. Why did we go through all of that chaos? Well, because this kind of repository doesn't save. It's in memory. Once you reload your application, the information is gone. But that's not really representative of what we're probably using something like this for. We want to save out to a location. So what we might do is say person save path. And that is going to be equal to application persistent data path plus something. And that ideally wants to save somewhere. So we'll, as it correctly guessed, I wanted to use JSON. So what I've got is a different kind of repository, JSON person repository. And that is exactly the same. It just happens to display the people from the repository with exactly the same thing. There's one big difference though. And the big difference is that this stuff exists in a file. And if I was to, just for right now, expressly reference the JSON repository, what I can do is I could say people.load. And I can load in all the people inside of that repository. It's giving me this issue because it wants to be asynchronous, because that's how I like to write it. So let's just do a load, actually, initialize application. Fine. Usually what I call this. I don't want to get too in the weeds about personal preferences and patterns, so I will just do that for now. Move this to the bottom, get rid of him, and that, and we won't be using this for now. We'll keep that as a reference, and then we'll mark this as a plumbing section. Right. Back to the simple version. So, people, initialize application, and then it loads the people. This is how most people treat their repository. But to go back to what I said earlier, the benefit of a repository is that you don't have to think of it in terms of saving and loading. It's in memory. It's just, there's some stuff, get some people. For an example of this is I have this other thing called an application. So build an application which takes in people, and it can take in some kind of way of displaying those people. I think I had a version of this previously made. What did I call it? Was it an application? My application. And app.init. So this is just another version of exactly the same thing, right? So here we have people, we're loading people. This is me just saying, oh, I made an app. Whatever the app does, it needs people to function. Now, what I can do, which is cool, is I can load the people and then feed the repository into the app. Now, when I go into this app here, notice how it doesn't actually say anything about loading and saving. This application encapsulates the behavior I want my application to have, which is, on initialization, say starting app. If we're using some debug data, pre-warm, in other words, like populate with a bunch of fake people, then say there are X people in the repository, list those people, and then list those people. So this lets me work in a hypothetical universe where there are something called people available to me from somewhere, and I don't really care how that happens. It's not really my responsibility. Downstream, the rest of the application can just work without the concept of saving. But how do we save? So where do we solve that problem? Well, even this I don't do. I don't expressly call save and load, because to do that, I would have to know this repository is savable. But what I can actually do is, if we switch this to a person repository, you'll notice load turns red, and it's like, hey, I don't know what load means. Repositories can't load or save, which is the point. They shouldn't be able to load or save, or at least that shouldn't be an implicit behavior, because an in-memory saving repository doesn't load, but a repository that loads from a file or connects to a web service might have a connect function or a load function or some other variation of setup required. But again, that's not the concern of anybody using a repository. That's a detail of how the construction of that system came to be, and then you start the application. And at some point, the application's over, and you need to resolve that state. So how do we solve that? Well, we just ask the question. If people is savable dot save. That's it. So now we don't actually want to save here. I'm kind of jumping the gun here. This is actually load. So we'll switch that to, should we name this persistent? That's what I'd usually call it. Persistent implies it can be saved and loaded, but whatever. Okay, persistent, and this time we actually want to load, and that will just load internally that collection of things. So here we go. Create our repository of people. If it's persistent, load them. If not, don't. And then the application starts and things begin. And we'll clear this for now because that's not relevant to what we're doing. So this is our application running inside of a sequence order. And then you're thinking, right, but what about saving that data back? Well, Unity gives us a nice handle for that on application quit. If persistent, save it. Done. And you can be more specific. Maybe you've got some flag in your app that says has been idle for X amount of time. Well, I've got a nice helper here called people, or is it? It's in the persistence, so I'll grab it here. You can basically say if persistent.isDirty. So has it changed from when it's previously been loaded in? If it hasn't changed, you've got nothing to save. Again, getting into the specifics of saving and loading and persistence and caching and all that stuff is kind of beyond the point. The point I want to make here is that saving and loading is a thing that a repository may do, but it's not an intrinsic part of the repository pattern. The repository pattern is the pattern that says, I provide you items, and there are possible queries related to those items that I'm intrinsically letting you know exist. You can stack this up with get related people, get people from country, get people over the age of, whatever those queries are, that's the point of repository. You are distilling the complex questions into easy to compose things, which also helps later when you get to nested objects. You might have a author and books. Maybe you want to say get author and books, which will resolve the list of books with the author. Or you might say get author and publisher. Or maybe you want to just get authors who have published this year, or so on. That's what a repository is for. Now let's look at some of the specifics of how this is all hooked up. So a default repository is just a list. It's an in-memory collection. It is a wrapper around what's already the default, collection. And then I just defer to each of the calls. Count is just get count. Add is just add. Enumerator is just enumerator, so I can do a for each on it. Get by ID is get by ID. Find all, and so on. So these are your basic functions. The JSON version is exactly the same, with the addition that when you add something, you set dirty is true. You remove something, set dirty true. When you load and save, you set it to false. And then it just loads into that content from the directory. So all of this is hidden from anybody consuming this code, which is quite nice. It means that downstream, once you kind of get to the point of your application, look how much information is being passed around. So this line is the only line in this entire chunk of code which kind of knows it's JSON. And in an application root, which is a whole different conversation, that wouldn't even be here. That would be somewhere else. This knows that it may or may not be persistent, but it doesn't know what it is. It might be persistent to a web service. It might be persistent to a save file. It might be persistent to anything. So then it gets passed into an application, and an application does application stuff. It doesn't know anything about saving or loading or whatever else happens to be happening. And then finally, when the application quits, it possibly saves it. So we are distilling the information down to who needs it in any given point in time. And yeah, that's basically the repository pattern. It's worth noting that the reason you have this level of fidelity is there's other patterns that stack up on top of this. One of them later on being the unit of work pattern. The unit of work pattern basically lets you do things with groups of data. So rather than a repository, what if you had 5 repositories? You have a repository of accounts, a repository of people, a repository of birthdays and various whatever other information you want. You can then do composite data. A common thing with social media services would be get people, get followers, add like. Like will actually add you to 2 collections based on followers and likes and things, and modify a bunch of data. So if you had multiple repositories, you could ask questions like get people who follow X, and then you could say add follower to people who follow X, and then counter follow, right? So it simplifies that code. But then by putting it into a unit of work pattern, you can check if it's dirty, do your saves, and then save at the end, and wrap the whole lot in a single using unit of work, perform work, save work, which is a nice additional benefit of doing transactions. Because if you know you're doing a chunk of work, which may or may not need to be saved afterwards, you can open a transaction, apply work, and then if transaction completes successfully, save. If transaction fails, roll back, right? So all of this stacks and stacks and gives you more freedom and behavior later. And all of this comes from the fact that the only people who really need to know whether it saves or loads is the root of the application starting and whatever callback decides to handle saving. So saving is not an intrinsic part of repositories. So the way I do it is I handle the basic concept of a repository, which is what is the CRUD operations? Create, read, update, and delete. What are the things you can do to an in-memory collection? And then you simplify it so it does just that. Then you would have a specific repository, which is, this is the repository of this thing, which has additional questions that may or may not be relevant, or additional ways to edit the data. Follow, favorite, or whatever else you might want to do. Some people disagree with putting actions on your repository. They like to have it be exclusively a entity style. There's the whole concept of REST resources, which is basically that everything should just be wrappers around CRUD operations. I don't entirely agree with that because I think it's quite handy to have the concept of loading all of a thing from a repository, or like I said, I don't even call it a repository, I call it people. Because there's a game and I had army, I might want to have army.go-to-formation or rally or whatever. I could load them into a separate thing and then do that. It's a lot of pointless effort. The truth is, while architecture does add layers, you kind of want to be judicious with which layers. And to me, the layer of there is stuff, it exists somewhere, there are questions I can ask about that stuff, and then an app asks those questions, is more than enough layers. I don't need another layer in between all of those. Anyway, so that's the basics. But then, if you have a specific kind of repository, like in the case of a JSON one, you might have something that is persistent. Persistent could be is dirty, saving, loading, and I've got force save, which basically means even though the data collection hasn't changed, force a save anyway, which might be if you're saving to disk for redundancy purposes or any other number of crazy reasons, but it's a common enough occurrence I included here. So, I hope that helps make the general idea of a repository a bit clearer. The bullet points in summary again are a repository wraps an in-memory collection, or at least appears to. And its sole purpose is to let everybody downstream see it as an in-memory collection, but it may or may not be. And then there are other operations which may or may not be included to allow it to persist or load or swap out or convert to different formats or whatever else you need to do, but that's not the job of that system. That way, if you have a UI can say, get me people who have not been assigned work. You can show them in a UI, you can modify the properties. You could then, when all of that's done, say, I'm finished. Whatever I was doing with the people is done. And another app can go, oh, you had the people a second ago, you were doing some menu modification stuff. Are they dirty? Is there changes from when I last saw this? Oh, there is? Save. Done. That question, that operation has nothing to do with the UI. You might be doing that to in-memory stuff, you might be doing it to save files, you might be doing that to a web API. And then on top of all of that, if you did have this set up, you can start to bake composite repositories. You can have a repository which reads in from 3 other repositories, caches it in local memory, lets you do a whole pile of stuff, and then saves that result out to your local version. A common example of this is I had a TV show repository that was actually an API that pulled all the information from an online TV API. But I didn't call it directly. What I did is I had a local repository, which is a JSON file. And I would then be able to say, get me TV show. And I would check the local cache repository. Does it exist? It does. There you go. If it doesn't, I query the API, pull the result back, save it to the local one. And now, next time you ask, it's a lot faster. And all of this, again, is completely hidden from the rest of the system. And then if you want to modify it, you can then same thing. Pull it down, make your changes, save your local copy, and you've got this nice, handy system. So, it's all about encapsulation of information. That is the repository pattern. And if anybody ever puts the word save or load in their contract for their repository, they're doing it wrong. And now hopefully you can explain to them why.